Hello there, welcome, Ungainly Titan here, and in this video we'll talk about the virtual tabletop application FantasyGrounds II, which can be used to run a pen and paper role-playing game in a networked environment, just like Roll20.net, which I spoke about previously, link in the video description. Both are virtual tabletops, that is, they can be used to play role-playing games such as Dungeons & Dragons, which normally require all the players to be present at the same table in real life. Unlike Roll20.net, which is a server browser-based application, if you prefer a cloud-based application, FantasyGrounds II is an application run locally on your computer, and this may be a factor if you're considering hosting a game, particularly if your upload capacity is limited. You'll also need to set up port forwarding on your network router if you're hosting a game, so there's some configuration with FantasyGrounds. Now, you're looking there at the Steam page for FantasyGrounds. It can be bought on Steam, and it can also be bought at www.fantasygrounds.com. Again, links in the description below. There are three license types. Demo, which is free, the standard license and the ultimate license. Now, the demo basically just allows you to try out functionality. Anything you create in the demo session is not saved. You'd have to do it again if you restart. I think you can connect one demo to another to check out connection issues and see if you can actually manage to do it. The licensing pricing is at the time of recording, but it's been pretty stable for a long time, and you can get it cheaper during sales. Steam in particular have sales quite often, and they have discounted prices on FantasyGrounds and on the modules for FantasyGrounds. The principal difference between the Ultimate and the Standard license is the Ultimate license can allow multiple hosts or multiple clients that have the demo version only. So essentially the cost is loading onto the DM, but that can be cost effective, particularly if a group shares, basically gives the money to the DM to buy an Ultimate license, because an Ultimate license is cheaper than 4 or 5 players buying separate licenses. So it depends on how many in the group and stuff like that, and how well the group know each other. I think FantasyGrounds has many advantages for a group that already know each other. You're going online, you're going with a group, because in my opinion it has a lot of superior advantages from the DM point of view. Now, I'm not going to go through the actual workings of FantasyGrounds in great detail, because we could be for hours talking about it. The application has a lot of functionality, and very powerful functionality, I think, from a DM perspective. So I am going to briefly mention certain aspects of the game and go through some of the main screens. But I think its big advantage is that it has very, very powerful organizational tools from the DM perspective, and it is much superior, in my experience, than Roll20. So your basic start screen is here, and you have essentially a number of buttons that allow you to do various things. So you have the load campaign button. This allows you to load an existing campaign, one you've already created, so that you want to run a game. So you basically select the load campaign button. It opens up a selection screen. You can select the campaign you want to load. You press the start button, and your campaign is loaded. This is obviously from a DM perspective. So this is what the load campaign screen looks like. So you have your select campaigns. You can select the campaign details. So you can set up a specific custom username, or you can take the default DM name. You can put in a password if you want to, for just a little bit of extra security in case somebody port scans. The address information, stuff like that, you don't have to worry about that. Your internal IP address is really of no interest to anybody. Your external IP address can be used for the clients to connect to your system, or you can use the enable alias, ugly roll cracked thief. You can generate a random alias, and you'll have to if your external IP address changes. There is no point in anybody trying to use the external alias that I have here, because by the time when I use that, my external IP is almost certainly changed by my ISP. Plus, I don't have port forwarding enabled in the moment, so you won't actually reach the client. If you create a new campaign, you can give it a name, you can select the rule set you're using, you can create a password, username for the DM, description of the campaign. You don't bother with the other screen, the address information and stuff like that. That's not going to be relevant. That's only relevant when you're actually running the game. Although you can test, I suppose, that you're connectable. But that's all that screen does. It just sets up the basic parameters of the campaign. You have to go in then, load the campaign, or run start to go into the campaign to actually set up the encounters, maps, NPCs, and all the rest of the good stuff that's needed. Or you can buy, of course, a module from whoever it is, whatever game systems rules you're using, or whatever is commercially available, to run a campaign and just run a module, a campaign based on that module that you've bought. The join game screen is what the user will be looking at. Essentially, you want to put in a username. Now, any username will do, but you want to keep it consistent from session to session on a given campaign, because the username connects you to the ownership of the character that you're using. So if you change your username each session, the DM will then have to release the character's ownership from the previous username, and then you have to retake the ownership of it, and it'll get very annoying very quickly. The host address is either the IP address of the host machine, its external IP address, or the alias that you're given that was generated when the campaign was created. Manage characters is a button you might never use. It basically allows you to generate characters locally, just to play around with character generation. Obviously, unless you buy the rule sets, so if you're playing, say, 5th edition D&D, then you have to buy the rule sets, and that's essentially spending the price of a player's handbook again. Then you're not likely to use character selection or character generation in the first place. You could create the characters totally manually. You'd have to read the manual and learn some advanced techniques for adding powers and spells and various other things like that, so that the system will parse them correctly. And it's much easier just buy the manual in many respects. You can import the characters generated locally into a campaign, and if you, for instance, own a manual that the DM doesn't own, but he's permitting you to use, so if you have, say, Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and you use spells out of Xanathar's Guide to create your character or feats or whatever, then you can import that character into a campaign that the DM doesn't have a book for, but he's allowing you to use. I have tried it insofar as I've imported the character into a campaign hosted by a friend of mine, and that used a book that didn't have, and the character still seemed to have the powers. We haven't actually tried playing the character in the campaign, so I don't know if there are going to be any problems or issues with the automation over that. We'll have a quick look at the default character for character sheet for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. This is the first page that appears out. You have the character's name, the class and levels, background, race. You have the stats down the left-hand side, special things like dark vision or whatever other special senses, AC, initiative, speed, saves on the right-hand side, and you have hit dice and various other things at the bottom. And then you have a series of tabs down the right-hand side that lead to different aspects of the character sheet, such as the skills page, which has all the abilities, which is everything your character can do, all the skills, the inventory, and finally the powers. It's the power section you'll probably run most often, and you'll probably have that section of the character sheet open all the time, so that you can cast your powers or use your powers or your various spells and keep track of how many uses of powers that you have available in front of you. And the other skills that are on the other pages, like initiative, perception, various other things that you might use on a regular basis, you might actually drag to the buttons on the bottom, the numbered boxes at the bottom of the screen, which acts as a kind of a quick toolbar to a lot of skills. And you can have multiple versions of this, because Shift and Alt and Control, I think, all open up different instances of that toolbar. Now, when you join a game as a player, you basically go into the join game section, you put in the appropriate phrase, and the DM shares out a map. Now, the key elements here are: on the left, you have the chat dialog box. This is where any dice rolls come up. The DM can issue dialog bubbles showing essentially descriptions or room descriptions. You can type out messages that your player might say or something like that. The middle section will be the battle map, and that'll be shared out by the DM. You won't have access directly to the battle map. So we think you can actually, once they become shared, you get the option of looking back over them again. So here you have the party members in one chamber, and they're facing off against some bad guys in the other chamber. On the top right, you have the combat tracker, which is the kind of heart of Fantasy Grounds. You can basically run the entire combat off the combat tracker, and you can ignore the map entirely and just run a theatre of the mind if you wanted to, because you can target enemies on the combat tracker. You can drop your attacks and your damage onto those enemies, and the automation will apply to it, so that the tokens don't have to be interacted with in the same way, and anything you do on the combat tracker, if it's properly connected up, will be reflected in the map. So if you've targeted a particular enemy and you move away, a range number will open up between you and the enemy, showing the distance to the enemy, so you can tell whether your various effects or spells or ranged attacks can still reach, or whether there are modifiers applied or whatever. And below that, I have the character sheet open. That's generally the way I set up my screen as a player when I'm playing Fantasy Grounds. So I have the combat tracker always open in the same location. I have the character sheet open, and they will happen by default. It is not a feature of the game that when a DM shares a map with you, the map opens in a kind of maximum view range and it covers up the whole screen and you have to resize it. It is a fault in the application, I think, that the map that was shared to you in a previous session should remember the way you had it laid out, in my opinion. So if you have it screened so as to fit between the combat tracker and the chat screen, it should fit again at the same time when it's reshared. It's a bit of a pain in the ass to have to redo it each time, but it's a minor niggle compared to some of the other advantages the game gives. This is the same setting for the point of view of the DM on the same session that I was showing you from the player's perspective previously. So again, I have it laid out in a kind of a similar fashion. So on the left you have the chat box, but after the chat box I have the story entry for the current part of the adventure that we're doing. So this is the setup and description of the combat encounter, with hyperlinks to the actual combat encounter, to specific map information, the description of the area that I can send out, and various other background information that I might need to know as a DM to run this encounter. At the same time, I have the map shared out, and you can see the pen marks, the little pens on the map. They're hyperlinks to the encounters. So I can click on them and I can get the story element, or I can get the encounter, the creatures for the encounter, which I can then add to the combat tracker, and that will also, if it's set up properly, cause the tokens to appear on the map. Now sometimes the tokens don't correctly appear on the map, so they could be dragged from the combat tracker then onto the map to set it up the way and configure it in the way I want, particularly if there was some kind of an on-the-fly encounter that wasn't included, so we say, in the initial planning or before the adventure was set up, and something happened that I just needed to create a map and just add monsters to it. This version, this is the real power, I think, of Fantasy Grounds, in that these story elements can give you access to information that you, in a hyperlinked fashion. So you can set up your whole campaign. You can have a table of contents. You can link all the different elements of the encounters to this table of contents, or you can link them to the map. So you can click on the map. You can get the inside the dungeon. You can have the kennel say encounter. So this is a description of the room. This is the exploration. This is a description of what goes on the west. This is the actual encounter. So you have a hellhound and 3 wolves. You click that and it adds it to the combat tracker, which then allows you to run the encounter. You have here, for instance, if I shut down the map, you have this particular adventure inside the dungeon. So you have the dungeon battle map appears. We have the kobolds and the hellhound encounter, which is the one that's revealed. And all of this can be linked back and forth, and you can have different story elements all in the campaign, which are all hyperlinked together. So it makes management of a campaign very, very simple, and it's very easy to add new story elements, because you just go to the bottom, should we say, and add a new encounter. Or you can just create a new story element, go into your story mode, and click and go plus, and there it is. And then you can then give it a title and drag it onto your existing table of contents, and then create all the map and other functionality needed to run that. So what does Fantasy Grounds allow you to do as a player? Well, as a player, it allows you to organize your character sheet. It gives you a character sheet that's pretty easy to manage, I think, and that is pretty flexible in terms of being able to put in powers and stuff like that. Some of it requires a little bit of study and work, but as a player, there isn't much to choose between Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds, and Roll20 is the obvious advantage of being cheaper. From a DM perspective, I think Fantasy Grounds wins hands down in my opinion, because Fantasy Grounds, though it costs you money, and I haven't really tried the paid-for version of Roll20. It didn't exist as an option when I switched to Fantasy Grounds. But Fantasy Grounds, in my opinion, is very, very good for organising your campaign because of the fact that you can hyperlink all the elements. So you can essentially have a story element that is a table of contents. You can have a map that is a kind of a master table of contents. You can link all your encounters, descriptions, NPCs, personalities, locations, plot lines, quests, the whole lot of them all back into a single starting point. And you can run a kind of a campaign diary using the story element notes and add in extra stuff on the fly and things like that as you need, or at least ahead of the session. It is very, very powerful from that point. Now, there are a couple of things it doesn't do. It doesn't draw maps. It doesn't do any kind of dynamic lighting. It does basic mask, same as in one in Roll20.net. It basically covers the whole map in a fog of war and allows you to reveal as you wish as the DM. Or you can operate without the fog of war. It's really up to yourself. Personally, I don't know. I think the more they do on maps, the harder they get. I've tried out map tools, and map tools are very powerful map tools for creating maps, but they're actually a huge learning curve and very difficult to learn. So if you want to draw maps yourself, or you're not using pre-purchased campaigns, it's not too difficult to do it. You can just add the maps into the campaign. I think you have to open up the maps and images and drag and drop in, or you can do it by accessing the folders. So on the issue of mapping, one of the things that it is, drag and drop can be problematic. So the easiest way sometimes to do your maps is go in when you have you're opening your campaign, go into the folder. So this is a particular campaign, that's the campaign name, that's the full address. And then you can go to your maps and you can decide which ones you want. So you have a look at this one, you say, okay, that'll be suitable, and you just drag it in. And if you go back in here and you now go to maps, it should be let's try new, and there it is. And you may want to rename it something more sensible. But there's your map in the system, and you can drag in all the maps you want at the start, but you're going to have to create your maps on an external application or find them online or whatever. These are the Dungeons, the Wizards of the Coast's Map of the Week archive that they used to do back in the noughties. They do a dungeon map every week, and you could download them, and there's a ton of them there. You can get a load of free maps, and you just populate them as you wish. So that, folks, is my overview of Fantasy Grounds. It does pretty much what you want, I think. There is supposed to be a successor version of it coming out with built on the Unity engine, and that's supposed to allow inline map drawing, in-game map drawing. I'm not convinced that it's a very good option. It adds a lot of complexity to the virtual tabletop. I know that I tried out using or tried learning map tools, I think, when I was researching virtual tabletops at the very start. Some of my players decided they didn't like it and they wouldn't use it, but I found that the learning curve on it was quite huge, because again, it was built around the idea of creating the map in the application. I think you're better off getting your maps elsewhere and having a virtual tabletop that just does what it says in the tin. Although added tools are probably no harm, as long as it retains its focus on maintaining the basic functionality. Fantasy Grounds does this, but it also has a lot of additional and quite easy to learn functionality. Just makes the organisation of the campaign really, really smooth from a DM's perspective. From a player's perspective, Roll20 is probably better, simply because it's free, it's cheap and free. Both of them are similar. From a game running perspective, I don't think there's much between them. Fantasy Grounds doesn't have a native voice comms, but you can use any other voice comm system with it: TeamSpeak, Skype, Discord, whatever it is you want, and that's not a problem. Therefore, but as a DM, definitely I think Fantasy Grounds is worth the money, simply because of the organizational tools and the fact that you don't have to refer to any external paperwork or application while you're running the game. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this informative and helpful, and as you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a like and a share. That really helps the channel out. If you've not already done so, please subscribe. Goodbye for now, and I'll catch you all again soon.